5 o'clock in the morning, summer, 1943. The Indiana sky glows orange and crimson against the darkness, but the sun won't rise for another 2 hours. This light comes from below, from 12 blast furnaces pouring rivers of molten iron into ladles the size of houses, from open hearth furnaces running at temperatures that would vaporize flesh on contact, from coke ovens that burn without ceasing, their flames reflected in the black waters of Lake Michigan. The air tastes like sulfur and sweat and ambition. It carries the metallic tang of iron oxide, the acrid bite of coal smoke, the particular chemistry of industrial transformation that happens nowhere else on Earth with this intensity, at this scale. Inside Gary Works, 30,000 men move in synchronized chaos across 4,000 acres of steel, fire, and concrete. The noise is so loud that workers communicate through hand signals, their voices swallowed by the roar of machinery that never stops. That hasn't stopped since the war began. That won't stop until the last ship is built and the last tank rolled off production lines somewhere far from here. The open hearth furnaces run at 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn solid metal into liquid in minutes, hot enough to kill a man who stands too close, who moves too slowly, who makes the wrong decision in the split second between safety and disaster. This is the largest integrated steel mill in the world, built on a strip of sand dunes that didn't exist as a city 40 years earlier. U.S. Steel didn't just construct a factory on this lakeshore, they built an entire civilization from nothing, conjuring a metropolis out of marshland and immigrant labor and corporate ambition so vast it defied comprehension. At its peak, 178,000 people called this place home. They raised families on wages paid in danger and exhaustion. They believed the steel would last forever because it seemed impossible that anything so enormous could ever disappear. And then it did. Not all at once. That would have been too merciful. Slowly, decade by decade, the jobs vanished, the people left, the buildings crumbled. What remains is a city of ruins and resilience, a monument to what America once built, and a warning about what happens when corporations decide that communities are expendable. Was Gary, Indiana, a triumph of American industrial ambition, or the most expensive company town ever abandoned? The story begins not in Indiana, but in the imagination of men who measured wealth in millions of tons and thought in timelines spanning generations. In 1905, the United States Steel Corporation controlled approximately 65% of American steel production. It was the world's first billion-dollar corporation, capitalized at $1.4 billion at a time when the entire federal budget barely exceeded that sum. The company had been formed just 4 years earlier, in 1901, when the legendary financier J.P. Morgan orchestrated the merger of Andrew Carnegie's steel empire with Federal Steel Company and several smaller producers. The men who ran U.S. Steel, Morgan, Carnegie initially, and then the lawyer and judge who would give his name to our story, Elbert Henry Gary, possessed a vision of industrial organization that the world had never seen. They believed that competition was wasteful, that stability came from consolidation, and that the purpose of a corporation was to impose order on chaotic markets. Carnegie had famously declared that, "Good wages and good workmen I know to be cheap labor," a philosophy that combined self-interest with a certain paternalistic concern for the workforce. If you paid men well and kept them working, they would produce. If they produced, you would profit. Judge Gary, as he was universally known, despite having left the bench decades earlier, brought to U.S. Steel a particular genius for public relations and corporate diplomacy. He understood that the size of the corporation made it vulnerable to government, antitrust action, to public suspicion, to the accumulated resentments of workers and competitors alike. His solution was to present U.S. Steel as a force for stability and moderation, a responsible steward of the nation's industrial might. He hosted dinners for steel industry leaders where prices were discussed openly, establishing a culture of cooperation that his critics called collusion. By 1905, Gary faced a problem that required a dramatic solution. Demand for steel was exploding across the nation. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, requiring millions of tons of rails and countless bridges. Skyscrapers rose in Chicago and New York, their frames constructed entirely of structural steel. The Navy was building modern warships that required steel armor and steel engines and steel hulls. Automobiles were emerging as a consumer product that would transform American life, and every automobile needed steel. The question was not whether U.S. Steel would expand, but where and how. The traditional approach would have been to enlarge existing facilities, the mills in Pittsburgh and Chicago and Birmingham that already produced the majority of American steel. But Gary wanted something more ambitious. He envisioned a facility that would be purpose-built from the ground up, designed with the latest technology, located where raw materials could flow in and finished products could flow out with maximum efficiency. He wanted to create the largest, most modern, most productive steel mill the world had ever seen. The site selection process that brought U.S. Steel to Indiana began with mathematics and ended with secrecy. The ideal location would have access to water transportation for ore boats carrying iron from the mines of Minnesota and Wisconsin. It would have rail connections to distribute finished products across the Midwest and beyond. It would have flat land suitable for the massive buildings that steel production required. And crucially, it would have cheap land that could be acquired without alerting speculators or existing communities to the corporation's intentions. The southern shore of Lake Michigan, in the northwest corner of Indiana, met every criterion. The region had been dismissed by settlers since the earliest days of Indiana's statehood. Senator John Tipton had declared in 1821 that this land could never be settled, would never hold value for the state, would remain forever the province of native tribes and fur traders. The terrain was forbidding, sand dunes and swamps, scrub oak and marsh grass, a landscape that resisted agriculture and discouraged development. What Tipton saw as worthlessness, Gary saw as opportunity. The swamps could be drained, the dunes leveled, the marshes filled. Lake Michigan offered unlimited water for cooling the blast furnaces and for transporting raw materials. 5 major railroad lines converged in the region. Through a subsidiary called the Indiana Steel Company, U.S. Steel began acquiring land. Corporation attorney Armanis F. Knotts negotiated the purchases in secret, buying up nearly 10,000 acres from local landowners who had no idea what the property would become. By maintaining the fiction that the purchases were unrelated, here a parcel bought by a mysterious out-of-state investor, there a tract acquired by a company with no apparent connection to steel, Knotts secured the entire site for a fraction of what it would have cost on an open market. On March 12, 1906, construction began. Engineers led by Ralph E. Rowley marched through a snowstorm to the site, driving stakes into the frozen ground to mark the outlines of what would become Gary Works. The date marked the official founding of a city that had not existed the day before, a metropolis conjured from corporate will and the labor of men who would arrive in their tens of thousands over the months and years to come. The scale of construction that followed defied contemporary imagination. U.S. Steel's initial budget for Gary Works and its accompanying company town was $65 million, though expenditures quickly exceeded that figure as the scope of the project became clear. By 1911, the company had invested $78 million in the mill alone, equivalent to more than $2 billion in contemporary terms, and construction was still ongoing. Teams of horses and mules began the work of transforming the landscape. 11 million cubic feet of sand had to be moved to prepare the ground for construction. Swamps required draining, dunes required leveling, and the entire terrain needed reshaping to accommodate buildings that would cover acres of ground. The workers who performed this labor arrived from across the country and around the world. Native-born Americans from the Midwest, immigrants from every corner of Europe, migrants who followed the promise of wages wherever industrial capitalism offered them. The construction workforce swelled to thousands, then tens of thousands. They lived in temporary camps, in tents and shacks, in whatever shelter they could improvise from the materials at hand. The Gary Land Company was simultaneously laying out the town site, but permanent housing could not keep pace with the influx of workers. Men slept 8 to a room in boarding houses, crammed into spaces designed for single families, because the alternative was sleeping outside in the Indiana weather. Within 2 years, the impossible had become real. On July 23, 1908, the ore boat Elbert H. Gary entered the newly constructed harbor with the first load of iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range. The ship was named for the chairman himself, a tribute to the man whose vision had brought this facility into existence. In December, the first of what would eventually be 12 blast furnaces began producing pig iron. By February 1909, 2 open hearth furnaces tapped the first heat of steel, and the rail mill produced its first finished product. In that inaugural year, 6,800 employees produced 570,000 tons of steel. To understand what Gary Works became, consider the numbers that accumulated over the following decades. By 1913, the facility operated 8 blast furnaces, 38 open hearth furnaces, and 560 coke ovens. By 1920, it contained 12 blast furnaces, 838 coke ovens, 45 open hearth furnaces, 2 25-ton converters, a rail mill, a billet mill, a slabbing mill, 2 plate mills, 12 merchant mills, an axle mill, a tie plate mill, a steel wheel plant, and a dozen mechanical shops covering 300,000 square feet. The buildings embraced over 100,000 tons of structural steel, 9,000 tons of corrugated sheets, 4,000 squares of tile roofing, and 163,000 bricks. The facility sprawled across 4,000 acres, more than 6 square miles, of lakefront property that had been worthless marsh and dune 14 years earlier. The process of making steel began with iron ore, shipped by lake freighter from the mines of Minnesota's Mesabi Range and Wisconsin's Iron Country. The ore boats arrived at the Gary Works Harbor, the harbor that had been dredged from Lake Michigan as part of the original construction, and unloaded their cargo into storage yards that could hold millions of tons of raw material. Coal arrived by rail from Appalachian mines, extracted from underground seams by miners who faced dangers at least as great as steel workers. The coal that arrived at Gary Works carried the labor of these miners, converted into fuel for the furnaces that would transform iron ore into steel. The first industrial transformation happened in the coke ovens. Coal cannot be used directly to fuel blast furnaces. It contains volatile compounds that interfere with the chemistry of iron production. Instead, the coal was heated in sealed chambers, driving off the volatile components and leaving behind coke, nearly pure carbon that burned hot enough to achieve the temperatures needed for iron reduction. The coke ovens were among the most polluting facilities at Gary Works, releasing tar, ammonia, benzene, and dozens of other compounds into the air and water. The neighborhoods closest to Gary Works experienced air quality that would be considered a health emergency anywhere else. The blast furnaces represented the heart of the integrated mill. Each one rose 10 stories high, a tower of brick and steel within which iron ore, limestone, and coke were combined at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to produce pig iron. The chemistry was straightforward in principle, but demanding in execution. Hot air, blown through pipes called tuyères, ignited the coke and raised the temperature. The carbon in the coke combined with oxygen in the iron ore, reducing the ore to metallic iron while producing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The limestone acted as a flux, combining with impurities to form slag that floated on top of the molten iron. The process ran continuously, day and night, month after month, year after year. A blast furnace cannot be easily started or stopped. Once ignited, it must be maintained at operating temperature for years at a time, with workers feeding raw materials into the top and drawing molten metal from the bottom in an endless cycle. The molten iron, called pig iron, accumulated in the bottom of the furnace and was periodically tapped, drawn off through a hole in the furnace wall into ladles that could hold dozens of tons of liquid metal. The temperature exceeded 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to kill instantly anyone who fell into or was splashed by the flow. Workers who tapped the furnaces wore protective equipment that provided only partial defense against these temperatures. The slag was drawn off separately and disposed of in various ways, used as aggregate for road construction, or simply piled in mountains of glassy, rocky waste that still dot the landscape around former steel mills. The pig iron flowed to the open hearth furnaces, where it was refined into steel. The open hearth process, the dominant technology of the early 20th century steel industry, was slower than the Bessemer process that had preceded it, but produced steel of more consistent quality. Each open hearth furnace held dozens of tons of metal at a time, maintaining temperatures high enough to keep the steel liquid while workers manipulated the chemistry, adding alloys and removing impurities until the metal met specifications. Workers learned to read the behavior of the molten steel through visual cues: the color of the metal, the pattern of the flames, the behavior of the slag floating on top. Experienced operators could judge temperature and chemistry with remarkable accuracy, making adjustments that ensured each heat met specifications. When the steel reached the proper composition, the furnace was tapped. Molten metal flowed into ladles, then into molds that would shape it into ingots for further processing. The ingots, rectangular blocks of solid steel weighing several tons each, were allowed to cool enough to be handled, then transported to the rolling mills where they would be shaped into finished products. The rolling mills represented the final transformation. The process varied depending on the desired output. Rails required different treatment than sheet steel, structural beams different treatment than wire rod. But the basic principle was consistent. Solid steel was reheated until it became soft enough to shape, then passed through successive sets of rollers that squeezed and stretched it into the desired form. The rail mill at Gary Works was among the most impressive operations at the facility, producing the rails that American railroads required by the millions of tons. Steel billets were heated in soaking pits until they glowed red-orange, then fed into a series of rolling stands that progressively shaped them into the distinctive profile of railroad rail. The process was violent, massive rollers spinning at high speed, forcing steel through gaps measured in fractions of an inch, producing finished rail at rates that seemed impossible given the mass of metal being manipulated. The sheet and tin mills produced flat products for customers in construction, appliance manufacturing, and packaging. Steel was rolled into progressively thinner sheets, sometimes coated with tin or other materials to prevent corrosion, then cut to customer specifications and shipped in rolls or flat stacks. These products found their way into automobiles, refrigerators, canned goods, building panels, and hundreds of other applications that consumers encountered daily without awareness of their origin. From there, the molten steel was poured into ingot molds, allowed to solidify, then moved to the rolling mills where it was shaped into rails, sheets, plates, bars, wire rod, or any of the dozens of other forms that customers required. The human dimension of this industrial achievement was equally staggering. By 1920, 52 nationalities made their home in the city that had grown up around the mill. Nearly 30% of the population was foreign-born, with another 30% having at least one foreign-born parent. They came from Poland and Slovakia, from Hungary and Serbia, from Croatia and Macedonia, from Greece and Romania and Lithuania and Italy. They spoke dozens of languages, practiced different religions, carried cultural traditions from villages scattered across Europe and beyond. They came because Gary offered something they could not find at home: wages. The steel mills paid better than agriculture, better than the grinding poverty of European peasant villages, better than the limited opportunities available to immigrants in the crowded cities of the East Coast. A man who could endure the conditions at Gary Works could earn enough to support a family, to buy a house, to send money back to relatives in the old country. The work might kill you, and it did kill workers, regularly and routinely, but the money was real. The diversity of the workforce created a city unlike any other in America. Gary in 1920 was arguably the most ethnically diverse place on the continent, a polyglot community where dozens of languages were spoken on the streets and in the churches and in the saloons that proliferated throughout the working-class neighborhoods. Each ethnic group established its own institutions: Polish parishes with masses in the mother tongue, Serbian Orthodox churches, Italian mutual aid societies, Hungarian cultural clubs. The diversity was not celebrated as such. This was decades before multiculturalism became a virtue in American public discourse. But it was undeniable. Gary was a city of immigrants and migrants, of people who had traveled vast distances to work in the mills that dominated the landscape. The boarding houses that lined the streets near the mill served as cultural crossroads where men from villages that had never heard of each other learned to coexist. A Polish steelworker might share a room with a Slovak, take meals prepared by a Croatian landlady, and work alongside Serbians and Hungarians whose nations had been at war within living memory. The mill itself became a crucible where old-world enmities dissolved, or at least were suspended, in the shared experience of industrial labor. Whatever hatreds men had carried across the Atlantic, they faced the same furnaces, endured the same heat, risked the same injuries. Mexican workers arrived from the Southwest, drawn by the same promise. African Americans arrived from the Deep South, part of the Great Migration that would transform American demographics throughout the 20th century. They fled Jim Crow laws and sharecropper poverty, seeking the industrial wages that the North offered. The mills hired them for the hardest and most dangerous jobs, the work that native-born whites and established immigrants avoided when possible. But the wages were better than cotton picking, and the Jim Crow laws of the South did not apply with the same force in Indiana. The company that built Gary understood that workers needed more than wages. They needed housing, schools, churches, stores, all the infrastructure of daily life. U.S. Steel created the Gary Land Company to develop the town site alongside the mill. The vision was comprehensive, a model company town that would attract the skilled workers essential to the mill's operation, while maintaining the social order that corporate management believed essential to profitable production. The first subdivision took shape between 1906 and 1909. The Gary Land Company constructed 506 permanent houses, substantial dwellings with modern conveniences that reflected the company's ambitions. Most were purchased or rented by company officials, executives, and skilled workers. The architecture was impressive. The streets were paved, and the infrastructure included modern sewage, electricity, and running water. Notable architects from across the country designed homes, churches, and civic buildings. This was the Gary that appeared in corporate brochures and newspaper features. A clean, orderly, prosperous community built by enlightened industrial capitalism. The schools that U.S. Steel helped establish became nationally famous through the Gary Plan, an innovative educational approach developed under Superintendent William Yurt. The Gary Plan emphasized vocational training alongside academics, using school facilities efficiently through a platoon system that kept buildings in continuous use. Students rotated between academic classrooms, workshops, and recreational facilities, preparing them for lives in the industrial economy the mill represented. Education reformers from across the country visited Gary to observe the system in action. New York City attempted to implement the Gary Plan in its schools, though the effort met with controversy and resistance. The relationship between Gary works, and the city evolved over the decades from total corporate control to something more complicated. In the early years, U.S. Steel dominated every aspect of Gary's existence. The company influenced local politics, sometimes directly through executives who held political office, sometimes indirectly through the economic dependence that made opposing corporate wishes difficult. As the city matured, this corporate dominance gradually loosened. Gary incorporated as a city in 1909, establishing municipal governance that eventually developed its own priorities. Workers organized not just in unions, but in churches, ethnic associations, and political organizations that represented interests beyond those of U.S. Steel. But the model community of the first subdivision represented only one version of Gary. The construction workforce and the unskilled laborers who filled the lowest positions at the mill needed housing immediately, and the Gary Land Company's development moved at the measured pace of corporate planning. These workers built their own housing in the southern area of the city, beyond the company's direct control. Shacks went up overnight, assembled from scrap lumber and salvage materials. This area became known as the Patch, and it developed its own character entirely. Over 200 saloons operated there, establishments with names like the Bucket of Blood that advertised their character. Gambling and prostitution flourished openly. As historian James B. Lane described, the Gary police chief of the era referred to the Patch as hell on wheels. Here men drank, brawled, and sometimes died. Here charming streetwalkers sold their wares in ways that workers from 50-plus nationalities could understand. Here men either stashed away their wages to return to the homeland, or bring wives and mail-order brides to America, or they gambled and drank away every sweated penny. The contrast between the orderly north side and the chaotic south side created two cities within. One, connected by the mill that employed workers from both, but separated by every other measure of social existence. The Patch was also a place of entrepreneurship, however crude. Immigrants who had arrived with nothing opened businesses serving their countrymen, butcher shops selling kielbasa and blood sausage, bakeries producing the breads of a dozen European traditions. taverns where men could speak their native languages and hear news from home. These establishments existed in legal gray zones, often operating without proper licenses, but they served essential functions for communities of men far from everything familiar. The saloon was not merely a place of vice. It was a social center, a labor exchange, a bank where men could cash paychecks and send money orders to families across the ocean. The work itself shaped men's bodies and minds in ways that those who have never experienced heavy industry cannot fully comprehend. A steel mill operates through the controlled application of extreme violence to raw materials. Iron ore, limestone, and coal are transformed into liquid metal through temperatures hot enough to melt stone. Consider the blast furnace worker. His job was to feed raw materials into a furnace operating continuously at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat radiated from the structure was intense enough to burn skin at a distance. The gases released during the process were toxic. The noise was so loud that hearing damage was virtually guaranteed over time. A shift lasted 12 hours, and at the end of that shift, the worker went home to sleep for a few hours before returning to do it again. Consider the open hearth worker. He stood before furnaces holding dozens of tons of molten steel, monitoring the chemistry through observation and instrument readings. The temperature at the furnace face approached 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit. Protective equipment was minimal by modern standards. Men worked in proximity to metal that would kill them instantly on contact, relying on skill and attention and luck to survive each shift. Consider the roller. His job was to guide steel through the rolling mills that shaped it into finished products. The steel arrived glowing red hot, moving at speeds that could catch an unwary limb and pull the attached body into machinery. The rollers, operated by instinct developed over years of experience, anticipating the behavior of the metal as it passed through successive stands, making adjustments measured in fractions of an inch. These jobs paid well because they were dangerous, demanding, and unpleasant. The company needed workers who would tolerate conditions that most men would refuse. The calculus was brutally simple. Risk life and limb for money that exceeded anything available in less dangerous occupations. The injury rates at Gary Works and mills like it were staggering by any modern standard. Workers lost fingers, hands, and arms to machinery that moved faster than human. Reflexes could respond. They suffered burns from splashing metal, from contact with hot surfaces, from the radiant heat that saturated every corner of the facility. They developed respiratory diseases from breathing air thick with coal dust, iron oxide, and the chemical byproducts of steel production. They went deaf from years of exposure to noise levels that would be illegal in any contemporary workplace. Death was not uncommon. Falls from elevated platforms, crushing injuries from moving equipment, asphyxiation from gas leaks, electrocution from faulty wiring. The ways that steel mills could kill were numerous and varied. Each fatality might merit a brief notice in the local newspaper, a collection taken up among the dead man's co-workers, a widow and children left to manage as best they could. The company provided no death benefits in the early years, no compensation for families whose breadwinners had been killed in the service of steel production. Workers accepted these conditions because the alternatives were worse. A man might die in the mill, but his family would eat in the meantime. He might lose a hand, but the wages he had earned would have purchased a house, educated his children, provided a foundation for the next generation's advancement. The bargain was grim but comprehensible. Trade your body for wages that could buy a future your body alone could never secure. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 brought the tensions that had been building since Gary's founding into violent confrontation. The demands were straightforward: an 8-hour workday to replace the 12-hour standard, higher wages to match post-war inflation, recognition of the workers' right to organize and bargain collectively. Judge Elbert Gary, directing corporate strategy from New York, refused to negotiate. His position was ideological as much as economic. He believed that unions represented an unacceptable interference in the relationship between employer and employee. When worker organizers requested a meeting, Gary declined. When the American Federation of Labor pushed the issue, Gary responded with public statements denouncing the strike as foreign-inspired radicalism, linking the workers' demands to the Bolshevik Revolution that had convulsed Russia 2 years earlier. The strike began on September 22, 1919, with approximately 350,000 steel workers walking off the job nationwide. It was the largest strike in American history to that date. In Gary, the response was overwhelming. 85% of the workforce joined the strike. The blast furnaces went cold, and production ground to a halt. The company's response combined public relations, racial manipulation, and state violence. Gary ordered the importation of strikebreakers from the South, recruiting between 30,000 and 40,000 African American workers with promises of steady employment at wages that exceeded anything available in Jim Crow Mississippi or Alabama. The strategy was explicitly designed to inflame racial tensions among the strikers. In many steel towns on the East Coast, the strategy worked. But in Gary, something different happened. Local union organizers, recognizing the threat, had worked throughout the organizing campaign to build solidarity across racial lines. Special meetings for colored iron and steel workers, for Mexican workers, for Polish and Serbian workers, had established relationships that the company's strategy could not easily break. At Gary's first Labor Day celebration in 1919, Union leader C.D. Elston addressed black workers directly, mocking the company's appeals to racial division. "Judge Gary says he will take care of us," Elston announced, "but if he did, we would all be in hell." Another organizer, Attorney L. Caldwell, followed. "Whether the strike be won or lost, I want to ask every man to conduct himself with due respect for civilization and humanity." The crowd cheered, hats flew into the air, and for a moment it seemed possible that solidarity might triumph over division. It didn't. On October 4, 1919, a riot erupted between strikers and strikebreakers in downtown Gary. 3 days later, Indiana Governor James P. Goodrich declared martial law. 4,000 federal troops under General Leonard Wood arrived in Gary with bayonets, machine guns, and artillery. They occupied a city named for the man whose corporation they had come to protect. The federal occupation lasted weeks. Soldiers broke up picket lines, arrested organizers, and prohibited the mass meetings that had sustained worker solidarity. Workers who had marched in their faded military uniforms, veterans who had fought in Europe for democracy, found themselves on the receiving end of American military power deployed on behalf of American capital. Mother Jones, the legendary labor organizer who had witnessed and participated in labor struggles for half a century, watched the occupation with horror and fury. Worse than the bayonets, she wrote, "They broke the ideal in the hearts of thousands of foreigners, their ideal of America. Into the blast furnace along with steel went their dream that America was a government for the poor, the oppressed." The strike collapsed in January 1920. The workers returned to the mills without gaining shorter hours, higher wages, or union recognition. Judge Gary had won, and his victory would shape labor relations in the steel industry for nearly 2 decades, until the Steelworkers Organizing Committee finally succeeded in the late 1930s. The 12-hour day continued until 1923, when pressure from Congress and President Harding finally forced the industry to adopt the 8-hour standard. The defeat left scars that persisted for a generation. Workers who had walked the picket lines returned to jobs where foremen remembered their faces. The most active organizers found themselves blacklisted, unable to secure employment in any steel mill in the region. The promise of solidarity across ethnic and racial lines, which had briefly seemed achievable during the strike's early weeks, dissolved into the familiar patterns of division that served management's interests. The failure also shaped how workers thought about collective action. For nearly 20 years, organizing drives in the steel industry faced the memory of 1919. The federal troops, the arrests, the eventual collapse. Workers who might have been receptive to union appeals remembered what had happened to their fathers and older brothers. The lesson seemed clear. The company was too powerful, the government too willing to intervene on its behalf, the costs of resistance too high. It took the Great Depression, the New Deal, and a new generation of labor organizers to overcome this legacy. The Steelworkers Organizing Committee, backed by the Congress of Industrial Organizations and operating under the protection of the Wagner Act, finally won recognition at U.S. Steel in 1937. The victory came not through a strike, but through a combination of political pressure, legal maneuvering, and the changed circumstances of the Depression era. Judge Gary had died in 1927, his successors proved more flexible in their approach to labor relations. One consequence of the strike would permanently transform Gary. The African American workers brought in as strikebreakers did not leave when the strike ended. They stayed, joined by continuing waves of migrants from the South, who saw in Gary the same opportunity that had drawn European immigrants a generation earlier. By 1930, Gary's black population had grown significantly, establishing the demographic foundation for the racial transformation that would reshape the city in the decades to come. At its wartime height in 1943, U.S. Steel employed more than 340,000 workers nationwide, with Gary Works accounting for approximately 30,000 of that total. The mill operated around the clock, 365 days a year, producing the steel that democracy required to defeat fascism. The products flowed into tanks that rolled across North Africa and Europe, into ships that crossed the Atlantic in convoys braving German U-boats, into aircraft that darkened the skies over Germany and Japan. A single tank required 18 tons of steel. A Liberty ship required thousands of tons. The nation produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war years, every one of them dependent on steel from mills like Gary Works. U.S. Steel ranked 16th among American corporations in the value of its World War II production contracts. The company doubled its output during the war years, constructing new facilities, rehiring retired workers, bringing obsolete equipment back into service to meet demand that exceeded anything peacetime production had contemplated. Government subsidies through the Defense Finance Corporation funded new blast furnaces and open hearth furnaces, expanding capacity that would prove excessive when the war ended and military demand disappeared. The compensation that Gary Works provided was substantial by the standards of the time. Steelworkers earned wages that placed them solidly in the middle class, enough to purchase homes, automobiles, and the consumer goods that American manufacturing produced. The benefits included health insurance, pensions, and the security of knowing that employment at a facility like Gary Works was essentially permanent for workers who performed adequately. A young man who joined the mill in his 20s could expect to work there until retirement, accumulating seniority and the modest prosperity that steady employment made possible. The relationship between Gary Works and the city it had created was always transactional. Gary existed because U.S. Steel had created it. The city's prosperity depended on the mill's continued operation, and when the mill contracted, the city contracted with it. The city government could not force U.S. Steel to maintain employment levels, could not compel investment in modern equipment, could not prevent the decisions made in Pittsburgh and New York that determined Gary's fate. Whatever autonomy the city had achieved was constrained by the fundamental economic reality that a company town remains dependent on its company. The city that served the mill grew in parallel. Gary's population peaked at 178,320 in the 1960 census, making it Indiana's fifth largest city and one of the major urban centers of the industrial Midwest. Broadway, the main commercial street, bustled with department stores and movie theaters that served not just Gary, but the entire surrounding region. The architecturally significant movie palaces that had been built during the 1920s, the Palace Theater, the Indiana Theater, drew crowds for first-run films and live performances. Downtown Gary was a destination, a place where working-class families could experience the consumer culture that their wages made possible. The prosperity was real, even if it was built on foundations that would prove less stable than anyone imagined. The seeds of Gary's decline were planted during its greatest triumph. While American steelworkers were producing the metal that won World War II, the war itself was destroying the steel industries of Europe and Japan. When Europe and Japan rebuilt, they built with the most modern technology available. The basic oxygen furnace represented one such technological leap. Developed in Austria in the early 1950s, the basic oxygen process could produce steel in 40 minutes rather than the 8 to 12 hours required by open hearth furnaces. The economics were compelling. Faster production meant lower costs per ton, which meant lower prices for customers, which meant competitive advantage in global markets. Japanese steelmakers adopted the technology rapidly. By the 1960s, Japan's steel industry had leapfrogged American producers in efficiency and cost structure. American steel companies, including U.S. Steel, responded with what can only be described as complacency. Why invest billions in new equipment when existing plants were still producing profits? The open hearth furnaces at Gary Works continued to operate, turning out steel through a process that dated to the 19th century, while foreign competitors adopted technologies that would define the 20th. Management chose short-term profits over long-term competitiveness, a choice that seemed rational quarter by quarter, but accumulated into strategic disaster. By 1959, the United States had become a net importer of steel for the first time since the Gilded Age. Foreign producers, operating newer mills with lower labor costs, could undersell American steel by as much as 20%. The 1970s brought the full weight of these accumulated disadvantages crashing down. The oil embargo of 1973 spiked energy costs, hitting energy-intensive industries like steel especially hard. Environmental regulations, long overdue given the pollution that steel mills had inflicted on surrounding communities for decades, added compliance expenses. Recession reduced demand for steel in construction and manufacturing, and always the imports kept coming. Japanese steel, German steel, Korean steel, cheaper and often better than what Gary Works could produce. The response from corporate leadership combined denial, blame shifting, and demands for government protection. Steel executives blamed unions for high labor costs, blamed environmentalists for regulatory burdens, blamed foreign governments for subsidizing their steel industries. They lobbied Congress for tariffs and import quotas, seeking protection from competition rather than investing in the modernization that might have made them competitive. When protection proved inadequate, they blamed the government for not providing enough. What they did not do, in sufficient measure, was invest in their own facilities. The capital that might have funded basic oxygen furnaces and continuous casting equipment instead flowed to shareholders in the form of dividends, to executives in the form of compensation, to diversification ventures that promised higher returns than the core steel business. U.S. Steel acquired Marathon Oil in 1982, renaming itself USX to signal its transformation from a steel company into a diversified energy and manufacturing conglomerate. The strategy was to use cash flow from declining steel operations to build positions in more profitable industries. The workers at Gary Works watched this transformation with a mixture of anger and helplessness. They had not failed to modernize the mills. They had not decided to pay dividends instead of investing in new equipment. They had not chosen diversification over core competence. They had shown up for their shifts, performed their jobs, built the products that left the facility. The decisions that sealed their fate were made elsewhere, by people who would never experience the consequences. The layoffs began in 1971, and they never really stopped. The first wave eliminated tens of thousands of positions across U.S. Steel's operations, with Gary Works bearing a significant share of the cuts. Union officials expressed shock at the magnitude. We had expected some layoffs, but now it seems like this thing is going to be a lot rougher than we had expected. But the shock would become routine in the years that followed. The employment trajectory tells the story with stark clarity. In 1970, Gary Works employed over 30,000 people. By 1980, the workforce had fallen to approximately 20,000. By 1990, only 6,000 workers remained. By 2015, the number stood at 5,100. By 2021, it had dropped to 2,500. By 2023, Gary Works employed 2,246 people, less than 8% of its peak workforce. Each position eliminated represented a family affected, a household income reduced or destroyed. A steelworker laid off at age 50 faced dismal prospects for equivalent employment. The skills that commanded premium wages inside the mill, the ability to read the color of molten steel, to sense the rhythm of a rolling mill, to survive conditions that would incapacitate the uninitiated, these skills translated poorly to the service economy that was replacing manufacturing across the American Midwest. The multiplier effect amplified the damage beyond the mill itself. For every position at Gary Works, additional jobs existed in the surrounding community. The restaurants where workers ate lunch, the car dealerships where they bought vehicles, the grocery stores where their families shopped, the contractors who maintained their homes, the teachers who educated their children. As steel employment fell, these ancillary businesses followed, Gary's population tracked the industrial decline with devastating precision. From 178,320 in 1960, the city fell to 175,415 in 1970, to 151,953 in 1980, to 106,046 in 1990, to 102,746 in 2000, to 80,194 in 2010, to 69,193 in 2020. Those who left were disproportionately white and middle class, drawn to the suburbs that ringed Gary, particularly Merrillville to the south, where housing was newer, schools were better funded, and the future seemed less bleak. The phenomenon of white flight cannot be understood apart from the racial dynamics that had characterized Gary since the 1919 strike. As the black population grew, from 21% in 1930 to 39% in 1960 to 53% in 1970 to over 80% by 2000. White residents departed at rates that exceeded the overall population decline. The Indiana branch of the Ku Klux Klan had organized in 1915, building what became by the early 1920s the largest chapter in the nation, with 2,000 new members joining weekly at its peak. The Klan's influence waned after scandals involving its leadership, but the attitudes it represented did not disappear. Redlining by banks, sanctioned by federal housing policy, made it nearly impossible for black residents to secure mortgages in certain neighborhoods, while simultaneously making it easier for white residents to purchase homes in newly constructed suburbs. Richard G. Hatcher's election as mayor in 1967 marked a genuine political achievement. He and Carl Stokes of Cleveland became the first black mayors of major American cities that same year. But it also coincided with the acceleration of both industrial decline and white departure. Critics then and since have blamed Hatcher and subsequent black leadership for Gary's problems. The argument fails to account for the larger economic forces that were devastating industrial cities, regardless of their racial composition or political leadership. Hatcher inherited a city already in economic freefall, already dependent on an industry that was shrinking. The decisions that sealed Gary's fate, the failure to invest in modern technology, the willingness to pursue short-term profits over long-term competitiveness. These decisions were made in boardrooms in Pittsburgh and New York, not in the mayor's office in Gary. Blaming black leadership for deindustrialization confuses correlation with causation, while conveniently absolving corporate decision-makers of responsibility for the consequences of their choices. The physical landscape of Gary transformed along with its demographics and economy. Buildings that had symbolized the city's prosperity fell into disrepair, then into ruin. The commercial core along Broadway emptied out as stores closed and customers departed for suburban malls. The City Methodist Church stands as perhaps the most poignant symbol of Gary's transformation. Completed in 1926 at a cost exceeding $800,000, equivalent to more than $14 million in contemporary terms, the spectacular 9-story complex included a 1,000-seat theater, offices, a dining hall, and a gymnasium. At its peak, the church served more than 3,000 congregants. The pastor who oversaw its construction, William Seaman, was ousted just 2 years after completion for opposing the segregation of church services, an early indication of the racial tensions that would reshape the city. By 1975, dwindling attendance and lack of funds forced the church's closure. In the decades since, ivy cascades like a waterfall through broken stained glass windows. The sagging remains of the choir loft cling desperately to the wall. The building has acquired a new name, God's Forsaken House. Union Station, once a major stop on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, met a similar fate. It closed in the early 1970s as rail passenger service declined. After decades of neglect, a local preservation group called the Decay Devils acquired the building in 2018 for $10. They have spent years clearing out debris and stabilizing the structure, hoping to transform it into a visitor center. A 2015 survey found that 37% of the city's structures, more than 12,000 buildings, were blighted and in need of visible repair. 20% of single-family homes stood empty. The Gary Department of Redevelopment estimated that 1/3 of all residential properties in the city were unoccupied or abandoned. In 1997, a series of devastating fires struck the downtown business district, destroying numerous buildings, including Memorial Auditorium. Arson was suspected in many cases, though the burned structures were often uninsured and economically worthless. The fires completed what decades of neglect had begun. The crime statistics that accompanied economic collapse made Gary notorious nationwide. By 1994, the city had earned the title Murder Capital of the United States, with 91 murders per 100,000 residents, a rate that dwarfed national averages and placed Gary among the most dangerous places in America. Drug trafficking filled the economic vacuum left by manufacturing. Gangs provided structure and identity for young people who saw no future in legitimate employment. The people most affected by the violence were the same people most affected by the job losses. Working-class families who lacked the resources to leave. The question of alternatives haunted Gary throughout its decline. Could the city have diversified its economy before the steel industry contracted? Could government have intervened to cushion the blow of deindustrialization? Gary did attempt diversification, though these efforts came too late and with too few resources to offset the loss of steel employment. The Holiday Inn Hotel and Genesis Convention Center represented attempts to attract visitors and develop a service economy, but a city with Gary's reputation could not easily compete with suburban alternatives. 2 riverboat casinos opened on the lakeshore in the 1990s, providing some employment and tax revenue, but gambling proved insufficient to replace manufacturing as an economic base. Government intervention was limited by ideology, resources, and political will. The federal government's response to deindustrialization across the Midwest was inadequate by any measure. Retraining programs that prepared workers for jobs that did not exist, trade adjustment assistance that provided temporary support, while industries permanently disappeared. State and local governments lacked the resources to address problems that originated in global economic forces beyond their control. The United Steelworkers Union, which had won recognition in the late 1930s and built substantial power in the decades following, could negotiate wages and working conditions, but could not compel companies to maintain employment levels or invest in outdated facilities. When U.S. Steel decided that Gary Works would shrink, no union contract could prevent the layoffs that followed. What does U.S. Steel owe to Gary? The question has no simple answer. The corporation built a city from nothing, summoned hundreds of thousands of people to a place that had not existed a generation earlier, extracted their labor for decades, and then, when economic conditions changed, when foreign competition intensified, when technological advances reduced the need for human workers, the corporation reduced its commitment to a fraction of what it had been. The company did not abandon Gary Works entirely. The mill continues to operate, producing millions of tons of steel annually. As of this recording, approximately 2,146 people still work at the facility, making it the largest single employer in a city that has no other employers of comparable scale. But the relationship between corporation and community has fundamentally changed. Where Gary Works once provided middle-class security for 30,000 families, it now employs a small fraction of that number. Automation has replaced workers at every stage of production. Computers monitor processes that once required experienced human operators. A modern steel mill can produce more steel with far fewer workers than the labor-intensive operations of the mid-20th century, but the workers displaced by that efficiency do not share in the productivity gains. U.S. Steel itself survived the steel crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. The corporation diversified, restructured, renamed itself USX, then reverted to U.S. Steel when the diversification strategy proved unsuccessful. It emerged from decades of turmoil as a smaller but still significant producer, with operations across North America. The company that built Gary still existed in transformed form, profitable and operational, even as the city it created struggled to survive. Today, Gary Works continues to operate as U.S. Steel's largest manufacturing facility, now under the ownership of Nippon Steel following the 2025 acquisition. The facility produces flat-rolled steel products, strip mill plate, and tin products for customers in automotive, construction, appliance, and container industries. The blast furnaces that remain operational, 4 of the 12 that once lit the Indiana sky, produce pig iron that feeds the basic oxygen furnaces that replaced the open hearths decades ago. Continuous casting has replaced ingot production for most products, eliminating one step in the process and the workers who once performed it. The environmental legacy presents its own set of obligations. Decades of steel production contaminated soil and groundwater across the mill site and surrounding areas. Heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and polychlorinated biphenyls required remediation that the company had long deferred. In 1998, the EPA reached an agreement with U.S. Steel to clean up the Gary Works site. Subsequent years brought additional penalties: a $2.2 million fine in 2016 for pollution at multiple facilities, $800,000 to remove contaminated transformers. Lake Michigan and the Grand Calumet River absorbed decades of industrial discharge from Gary Works and the other steel mills that line the Indiana lakeshore. The true cost of steel production, externalized onto workers, communities, and the natural environment, was never fully reflected in the price of the products that left the facility. The physical infrastructure that U.S. Steel had built to serve Gary Works deteriorated along with the facility itself. The Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railway, a U.S. Steel subsidiary that had served the mill since its founding, was sold to Canadian National in 2009. The Pittsburgh Steamship Company fleet of ore boats, which had carried iron from Duluth to Gary for decades, was leased to other operators. The rail yards and switching facilities that had connected Gary Works to the National Transportation Network fell into disuse as production declined. The Gary Sanitary District, created in the early 20th century to manage the city's waste, continued to operate wastewater treatment facilities that served a population far smaller than the system had been designed to accommodate. The infrastructure of a city built for 178,000 people had to be maintained by a tax base representing fewer than 70,000. The mathematics were unsustainable without outside assistance, and outside assistance was limited. In June 2025, a new chapter opened for Gary Works. Japanese steelmaker Nippon Steel completed its acquisition of U.S. Steel, a $14.9 billion transaction that had faced opposition from two American presidents before finally receiving approval. Former President Biden had blocked the deal on national security grounds in the final weeks of his administration. President Trump initially expressed skepticism before eventually supporting the acquisition after Nippon committed to substantial investments in American facilities. The deal included promises that previous owners had never made. Nippon Steel announced plans to invest $11 billion in U.S. Steel's American operations, with $3.1 billion specifically designated for Gary Works between 2025 and 2028, $400 million in 2025, $900 million in 2026, $800 million in 2027, and $1.1 billion in 2028. It represents more than triple the previous investment pledges for the facility. The first phase includes $200 million to improve the hot strip mill, optimizing production costs and expanding premium product offerings including heavy-gauge line pipe and automotive steel. A planned reline of Blast Furnace 14, the largest at the facility, will extend its operational life by decades. Gary Works will remain U.S. Steel's largest manufacturing plant, now under Japanese ownership, but still bearing the name of the judge who founded it more than a century ago. Gary's mayor called the investment a powerful affirmation of the future of steelmaking in our city. Yet critics have raised concerns. Environmental advocates note that relining blast furnaces commits the facility to coal-based steel production for decades to come, at a time when the industry faces pressure to reduce carbon emissions. Community groups have pleaded with Nippon Steel to implement stricter air pollution controls and to invest in cleaner direct reduction technologies rather than prolonging the life of existing equipment. The story of Gary, Indiana, offers lessons that extend far beyond a single city or a single industry. It is a story about the nature of corporate capitalism itself, about what happens when communities are created to serve economic interests and then discarded when those interests change. Gary was not a failure of planning or execution. In many ways, it represented a triumph of both: a city designed from scratch to optimize steel production, built with enormous investment and technical sophistication, operated profitably for decades. The failure lay in the assumptions underlying the enterprise, the belief that corporate interests and community interests would remain aligned indefinitely, that workers and their families were factors of production rather than stakeholders with claims on the enterprises they helped build. The workers who constructed Gary Works, who poured its metal and shaped its products, who endured 12-hour shifts in conditions that would be considered criminal by contemporary standards, did not fail. They worked. They raised families. They built unions and churches and schools. They created a community from nothing, and they watched that community hollow out when the corporation decided it needed fewer of them. The population loss has slowed in recent years. Gary's 2020 census count, while lower than 2010, showed a smaller decline than previous decades. Crime rates have fallen significantly from their worst levels in the 1990s. The murder count dropped to 24 in 2024, a 37% reduction from the previous year. Community organizations have emerged to address challenges from youth violence to vacant lot management. Artists and entrepreneurs have discovered possibilities in buildings that larger corporations long ago abandoned. Whether these signs represent the beginning of genuine recovery or merely a stabilization at diminished levels remains uncertain. Gary will never again be the city of the century, the magic city that grew from 0 to 175,000 in 50 years on the strength of steel production alone. But nearly 70,000 people still call Gary home. They maintain their properties, advocate for investment, remember what was while working toward what might be. They have demonstrated a resilience that statistics cannot capture. The abandoned buildings that draw urban explorers from around the world tell only part of the story. The City Methodist Church, with its cascading ivy and crumbling choir loft, makes for dramatic photographs that circulate on social media as evidence of American decline. But the churches that still operate, the schools that still educate, the businesses that still serve customers, the families that still call Gary home, these tell a different story, one of persistence in the face of circumstances that would break less resilient communities. The churches that served Gary's diverse population have shown remarkable resilience. City Methodist Church may have become a ruin, but dozens of congregations continue to meet in buildings throughout the city. These churches provide not just spiritual services, but social infrastructure, food banks, youth programs, community organizing, the connections that hold neighborhoods together when economic foundations have crumbled. The religious diversity that characterized Gary from its founding, Catholic parishes for Polish and Italian immigrants, Protestant churches for native-born Americans and African-American migrants, synagogues and Orthodox churches, continues in diminished but persistent form. The Gary Community School Corporation, which once served over 40,000 students with the innovative Gary Plan curriculum that drew national attention, now operates fewer schools for a fraction of that enrollment. Closed school buildings dot the landscape, some repurposed, most abandoned. The homes that steelworkers built during Gary's boom years show the full range of outcomes that time and circumstance produce. Some have been maintained for generations, passed from grandparents to parents to children who chose to stay. These homes display the pride of ownership, with trim lawns and painted trim, and the accumulated improvements of decades. Others stand vacant, windows boarded or broken, roofs sagging. Still others have disappeared entirely, replaced by vacant lots where foundations mark the footprints of structures that once sheltered families. The investment that Nippon Steel has committed is not philanthropy. The company acquired U.S. Steel because it believes the acquisition will generate returns, because it sees strategic value in American production capacity. The commitment to Gary Works reflects calculations about market demand and competitive positioning, not obligations to a community that has suffered for decades from corporate decisions made elsewhere. And yet, the investment is real. The jobs it will preserve are real. For a city that has spent 50 years watching its economic foundation crumble, the difference between corporate indifference and corporate investment, even investment motivated purely by profit calculations, can be the difference between continued decline and possible stabilization. This is the bargain that communities like Gary have always struck with the corporations that created them. Accept dependence on forces beyond your control, hope that corporate interests and community interests remain aligned, and cope as best you can when they diverge. It is not an equal bargain. The corporation can always leave, while the community cannot. But it is the bargain that American capitalism has offered since the first company towns rose in the 19th century. The metal that left Gary Works is everywhere, though it carries no mark of its origin. It holds up bridges in Chicago and skyscrapers in New York and stadiums in cities across the continent. It went to war in ships and tanks and aircraft, carrying American power to every theater of the Second World War. The people who made that medal left descendants who scattered across the nation, carrying with them memories of what Gary once was. What Gary teaches us about America is uncomfortable but essential. We build with enormous energy and ambition, and we abandon with equal facility. Communities are vulnerable to decisions made far away by people who will never experience the consequences of those decisions. The workers who build wealth rarely control what happens when that wealth moves elsewhere. The improvements to transportation infrastructure, the South Shoreline commuter rail that connects Gary to Chicago, the Gary-Chicago International Airport, that economic development officials hope will attract logistics businesses, might eventually support economic diversification. The artistic and cultural communities that have discovered Gary's abandoned buildings as spaces for creativity might, over time, attract the kind of investment that has transformed other post-industrial neighborhoods. Or the decline might continue, slower perhaps than in the past, but persistent nonetheless. The competition that devastated American steel in the 1970s and 1980s has not disappeared. It has evolved into new forms as Chinese and Indian producers have joined the global market. The automation that eliminated jobs at Gary Works will continue to reduce labor requirements as technology advances. The demographic trends that have driven population loss, aging residents, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, the accumulated effects of decades without economic growth, show no sign of reversal. The honest answer is that no one knows. The future depends on decisions not yet made, investments not yet committed, technologies not yet developed, and economic conditions not yet emerged. What we know is the past, the choices that created Gary, the forces that built it up, and the combination of corporate decisions and global changes that hollowed it out. What we can see is the present, a diminished city, a reduced but operating mill, people who have chosen to stay and others who have recently arrived, all navigating circumstances inherited from a century of industrial history. The question is not whether Gary will survive. Clearly, some version of Gary will persist, but what kind of survival it will be. Will the Nippon investment deliver the stability that corporate promises have failed to provide for decades? Will the jobs that remain be enough to sustain a community? The answers lie in the future, in decisions not yet made, and investments not yet allocated, and market conditions not yet known. For now, there is only the present. The blast furnaces glowing against the Indiana sky, the workers arriving for shifts that their great-grandparents would recognize, the city stretching south from the lakefront in its complicated mix of persistence and abandonment. The metal remembers, even when we forget. The furnaces still burn. The story continues.